Wadsworth Bear and his two companions were all horrified at the sight. Even Mr. Six was stunned, standing there with a knife in his hand, not knowing what to do. Ding! Storyshots reminds you to click the subscribe button at the bottom right corner to read the full novel. In 3 seconds, no, 2 seconds, nearly 70 people were all lying on the ground. Their kneecaps shattered, rendered useless. Zane Soulsby looked at Kent Black with a faint smile. Cold sweat dripped down Kent's forehead as he instinctively glanced at Godfrey Mock. Wadsworth also looked at Godfrey, his eyes filled with hope. Godfrey was momentarily shocked, but the next moment, he calmed down. So you're a metahuman, but kid, you're not the only metahuman in this world. After saying that, he shouted loudly to his right, Mr. Fuqua. Zane followed his gaze and saw a small dining table in the distance where 3 people were sitting. The man called Mr. Fuqua stood up, a look of helplessness flashing in his eyes. I thought I wouldn't need to take action, but it seems your people are truly useless. Godfrey smiled awkwardly. Yes, otherwise, how could we show your strength? Nehemiah, it's rare to encounter a civilian metahuman, don't you dare fight me for him. Mr. Fuqua said, stomping his foot and swiftly charging towards Zane. True chi wrapped around his fist. An ancient martial artist. A trace of excitement flashed in Zane's eyes. This was the second metahuman he had encountered after Thor Woods. He was eager to see what this guy was capable of. He threw a punch. At the moment their fists collided, a look of disappointment flashed in Zane's eyes. Too weak. Weaker than Thor Woods. Kid, you're out of luck. When you meet the King of Hell, you can tell him the person who killed you is Scott Fuqua. As soon as he finished speaking, a terrifying force emanated from Zane's fist. Scott's face showed horror, and the next moment, his body was sent flying backward. He crashed heavily to the ground, spitting out a mouthful of blood. The scene fell into silence. Everyone present stood up, completely shocked that Scott had been sent flying by Zane with one punch. Seeing the disappointment in Zane's eyes, Nehemiah was furious. He roared, stomped his foot, and leaped into the air, delivering a fierce kick. This kick came with a sharp, tearing force. Zane extended his hand, easily grabbing his ankle, and then slammed him to the ground. With a loud bang, a deep pit appeared on the ground. Nehemiah's face turned gray, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, his eyes filled with fear as he looked at Zane. The remaining man swallowed hard and said, "We are from the Metahuman Alliance. If you dare to harm us, the Metahuman Alliance won't let you go." Zane paused. He had heard about the Metahuman Alliance from Thor Woods. It was a massive organization, and many ancient martial families had joined it. Its power was immense, completely overshadowing the Dragon Squad. If not for the Dragon Squad being recognized by the nation, the Dragon Squad would have been forced to join the Metahuman Alliance due to its strength. The man saw that Zane wasn't moving and thought he was scared. He showed a look of pride. "I'll give you a chance. Kneel down and kowtow 3 times, and I might consider letting you join the Metahuman Alliance." Zane sighed. He couldn't understand how such an idiot could be a metahuman. With a flick of his finger, a silver needle shot out, piercing the man's dantian. His smile froze, and the next moment, he spat out a mouthful of blood. "He destroyed my dantian. He ruined my cultivation." The man's face was filled with anger, fear, and resentment. Zane didn't even look at him. He walked over to Scott Fuqua, looked at his pale face, and said lightly, "If the King of Hell sees me, he will come for you the next day." After speaking, he slapped his dantian, destroying his cultivation as well. Scott's face turned bloodless. He knew he had encountered a tough opponent and only hoped Zane would spare their lives. Seeing Zane approaching, Nehemiah turned over, kowtowing repeatedly, "Please, spare me. I promise never to be your enemy again." Zane ignored him and kicked him in the abdomen, destroying his cultivation. Nehemiah spat out a mouthful of blood, looking at Zane with hatred. Zane lit a cigarette, his gaze falling on Godfrey, Kent, and Wadsworth. "Now it's your turn." Kent shivered all over, immediately kneeling down. "Mr. Soulsby, I was wrong. I was blind and foolish. Please, have mercy and spare my life. From now on, you will be the ruler of the underground world in J City, and I will be your loyal dog." He was indeed capable of both humility and submission. Zane pointed to the 2 people beside him and said, "Kill them, and I'll spare your life." Murderous intent flashed in Kent's eyes. Without hesitation, he took out a golden knife and stabbed Godfrey directly. With a swish, Godfrey's eyes widened in disbelief as he looked at Kent. You. Godfrey clutched his throat as his body slowly collapsed. Wadsworth shivered all over at the sight, quickly kneeling down and kowtowing repeatedly. Mr. Soulsby, I was wrong. Please spare my life. From now on, I will be your loyal dog. Kent glanced at Zane and, seeing no reaction from him, gritted his teeth and stabbed Wadsworth in the neck with the golden knife. Blood flowed out. Kent stabbed back and forth forcefully, as if only this could reduce his fear significantly. Zane looked at him and, after a long moment, felt utterly bored. Kill these 3 useless members of the Metahuman Alliance, then hand over to Mr. Six. I want the underground world to spread the word that Mr. Six is the new leader by tomorrow. Yes, yes. Zane nodded and turned to walk downstairs. After Zane left, Kent sat down on the ground with a thump. The wind blew, and a bone-chilling cold swept over him. His entire body was drenched in sweat. Mr. Black, didn't you hear what Mr. Soulsby just said? Mr. Six looked at him with a half-smile. Kent bit his lip. He knew that to survive, he had to follow Zane's orders. Although killing the Metahuman Alliance members would be troublesome and might even lead to his death, he had no other choice. Gritting his teeth, he walked slowly over to Scott Fuqua. I'm sorry. He slit Scott's throat with a knife. After killing 1 person, the remaining 2 were much easier. After finishing all this, Kent Black cried. The 60-year-old man cried like a child. Mr. Six walked over, patted him on the shoulder, and said with a smile, Do you know why Mr. Soulsby wants to take down Wadsworth? Kent looked up and shook his head blankly. Mr. Six's eyes gleamed coldly. It's because Wadsworth's son deeply hurt Mr. Soulsby's friend. Mr. Soulsby said he wanted Wadsworth's family to suffer the same humiliation his friend did. He paused and continued. Tomorrow, I will take over the underground world of J City, and you need to use all your resources to find Wadsworth's wife and daughter. For what purpose? To suffer the same humiliation Mr. Soulsby's friend did. Mr. Six said coldly and then turned to leave. Kent's face was horrified. He knew that if he really did this, he would be despised by the entire underworld. In the future, no one would respect his seniority. They would only loathe him. After a long time, Kent sighed deeply. To stay alive, he could only follow Mr. Six's orders. The next day, an earthquake shook the underground world. Mr. Six quickly took over the territories of Godfrey and Wadsworth with astonishing speed. Kent voluntarily handed over the 5 Lakes gang to Mr. Six and did something shocking. He found Wadsworth's wife and daughter and ordered them to be humiliated to death. In one day and night, with Kent's cooperation, Mr. Six became the leader of the underground world in J City. Although his position was not yet stable, with Mr. Six's abilities, it was only a matter of time before he solidified his power. The entire underground world was talking about Mr. Six, while Zane was remembered by only a few. Zane had been sitting in the villa for several days now, and Ginny still had not returned, not even a word from her. He felt that he should have a good talk with Ginny. If she really wanted a divorce, they could part ways amicably, there was no need to make such a fuss. Thinking of this, Zane picked up the car keys and drove his car to the King Group. It was already past 6 in the evening, and Ginny was about to get off work. Zane stood by his car, quietly waiting. Soon, Ginny came out. She was dressed in a professional suit with her hair styled in a high ponytail. She exuded a competent and capable aura. The moment she appeared, she immediately attracted a lot of attention. Zane's lips curled up. Although he was quite bothered by Ginny and William's affair, seeing her charming face made him momentarily forget everything. All that remained were beautiful memories. Just as Zane was about to approach, his smile froze. Ginny, wait for me. William Mercer, leaning on a crutch, came chasing out. Ginny glanced at him, hesitated for a moment, and then walked over to support him. William smiled and said softly, Thank you. No need to thank me. Let's go have dinner. Ginny carefully placed him into the car and then took the driver's seat. Zane took out a cigarette, lit it, and exhaled a puff of smoke with a self-mocking smile. With Zane's current power, he could easily make William disappear from this world. But he didn't. He had his pride too. For 3 years of marriage, Ginny had always been the beneficiary of love, while Zane was the giver. Now, Ginny was walking together with her idealized lover. No matter the reason, Zane would not take the initiative to question or confront her. If their fate was not yet severed, Zane believed she would come to him. If it was severed, then let it be. Zane's eyes dimmed. He silently got into the car and quietly stared out of the window. Who knows what he was thinking? At this moment, his phone rang. Zane took out his phone and saw that it was a call from April Salazar. He answered the call, and April's crying voice came through. "Zane, my mom died." Zane was silent for a moment, then asked, "Are you at the hospital now?" "Yes. I'll come find you." After hanging up the phone, Zane drove over. Upon reaching the hospital, April was crying very sadly. Her mother lay on the hospital bed, covered with a white sheet, ready to be taken to the morgue. April was trembling as she held the pen. She knew that once she signed, her mother would be completely gone. She saw Zane, and her hand stopped trembling. Just as she was about to sign, Zane came over and stopped her. "There's still hope," Zane said seriously. The doctor nearby heard Zane's words and said coldly, "Sir, she is already very sad. By saying this now, aren't you just stabbing her in the heart?" Zane didn't respond to the doctor but seriously asked April, "Do you believe me? Your mom can really be saved." The doctor was getting impatient. "Hurry and sign. I have another surgery to perform." April looked at the doctor, then at Zane, and finally signed the paper. "Zane, I know what you mean. You don't need to comfort me. The dead can't come back to life." April's face was pale. The doctor glanced at Zane, a mocking smile on his lips. Trying to deceive a girl, and not even coming up with a good reason. He instructed the nurse to push the body to the morgue, waiting for the funeral home's people to collect it. Just as the nurse was about to move, Zane stopped them. "What are you doing?" The doctor was furious. Zane swiftly pulled off the white cloth and then took out silver needles from his pocket. "Stop! You are insulting the deceased," the doctor shouted shrilly. Zane ignored him and quickly inserted the silver needles into her body. Too fast. By the time the doctor ran over, Zane had already inserted all the silver needles. "You!" The doctor was furious, pointing at Zane but not knowing what to scold him for. Zane pushed him aside and walked towards the two figures standing nearby. It was the black and white deities of death. They looked helpless. When Zane arrived, they had already bowed to him, but Zane ignored them. Instead, he quickly walked towards April. The black and white deities of death listened to Zane's words and knew that they couldn't take this soul away, so they stood there with April's mother's soul, waiting. "Greetings, your holy sovereign." The black and white deities of death bowed. Zane nodded. After having so many dreams, he understood why the black and white deities of death respected him so much. He grabbed April's mother's soul by the hand, pulled her to the bedside, and said, "If you don't want to die, lie down yourself." April's mother looked at Zane, then at the black and white deities of death. She was very afraid of the black and white deities of death, but seeing April's red and swollen eyes from crying, she gritted her teeth and decided to take a gamble. Even if the black and white deities of death shattered her soul, she wouldn't mind. With this thought, she lay down. The white deity of death said, "Your holy sovereign, we will take our leave now." Zane was about to nod but then remembered something. "How can I summon you proactively?" The white deity of death said, "You only need to call out our name with your magical power, and we will come to find you." Zane nodded and waved them off. The black and white deities of death bowed, turned their bodies, and disappeared. Zane placed his palm on April's mother's forehead, focused his mind, and fused her soul with her body. However, she had leukemia, and her bodily functions had almost stopped. But Zane didn't mind. What he had just performed was the yang needle from the yin-yang needles technique created by ancestor Hongyun. The yang needle has the power to heal injuries. Even if the three flowers, representing one's essence, energy, and spirit, are cut off, the yang needle can restore them. The yin needle was more vicious. Ancestor Hongyun, being a kind person, had never used it in his life. However, not using it didn't mean it wasn't terrifying. When the yin needle is employed, it disrupts the 5 qi, the 5 essential energies connected to the liver, heart, spleen, lungs, and kidneys, and shatters the 3 corpses, 3 malevolent spirits residing within the body. Even the great golden immortals would find it hard to escape the fate of body and soul destruction. Zane's face gradually turned pale. Using the yang needle was easy, but to truly unleash its power required Zane's magical energy. His magical energy was too low now, so he could only sustain it for 3 minutes. But 3 minutes was more than enough to deal with leukemia. Gradually, April's mother's chest started to rise and fall. The cursing doctor beside them gradually closed his mouth as he witnessed the scene. He walked over in disbelief. Then, he saw April's mother's throat move, and she opened her eyes. Her gaze was blank. But she was alive. Brought back from the dead. Holy crap, the doctor cursed, then quickly said to the nurse, "Hurry, get her to the ward." The nurse, also witnessing this miraculous scene, glanced at Zane in shock, then pushed the hospital bed into the room. April was completely dumbfounded. Although she had always known Zane was not an ordinary person, she never imagined he could bring someone back to life. Seeing this, Zane breathed a sigh of relief, but a wave of fatigue washed over him. He felt very weak. His body swayed, his eyes closed, and he passed out. April exclaimed in surprise and hurriedly supported Zane. Once again, Zane found himself dreaming. He was looking at the old man above, a sight he had grown accustomed to. Suddenly, he felt someone watching him. He turned his gaze and saw a man dressed in a red robe, holding a gourd, looking at him. The man's face was kind, with a gentle smile always on his lips. Ancestor Hong Yun. Zane smiled back at him. The next moment, he saw Ancestor Hong Yun slightly raise his hand, and the gourd flew towards Zane. Zane reached out and caught the gourd. Memories about the gourd flooded his mind. 99 Red Cloud Soul Dissipating Gourd. Zane was momentarily stunned, looking at him in confusion. Ancestor Hong Yun smiled slightly at Zane, then looked towards the old man above. Zane retracted his gaze and also looked at the old man. Unconsciously, he began to feel dazed, as if he was in some sort of trance. He didn't know how much time had passed, but his right hand felt numb. He opened his eyes and saw April lying by the bedside, her head resting on his right hand. Zane moved slightly, and April instantly sat up. Seeing Zane open his eyes, she showed a joyful expression and hugged him tightly. "Zane, thank you, my mom is fine now." Zane also smiled, but the next moment, his gaze focused. On his left hand, there was a gourd. Zane gasped, "This is the 99 Red Cloud Soul Dissipating Gourd?" "Hello, sorry to interrupt." At this moment, the doctor from before walked in. Although a day had passed, he still looked at Zane with amazement. With a thought, the 99 Red Cloud Soul Dissipating Gourd disappeared, and a gourd-shaped mark appeared on Zane's wrist. April stood up. The doctor, standing at the foot of the bed, smiled kindly. "Hello, my name is Arlo Joan. I apologize for what happened before." Zane waved his hand, indicating it was no big deal. "It's like this, I told my teacher about what happened with you, and he wants to meet you." "Can I let him in?" Zane responded nonchalantly, "Let him in." Just as he finished speaking, an elderly man with graying hair walked in, his eyes gleaming as he looked at Zane. "Mr. Soulsby, can you tell me who taught you that needle technique you just used?" The old man stared intensely at Zane. Zane raised an eyebrow and said, "No comment." The old man took a deep breath and suddenly knelt down. "I beg you, Mr. Soulsby, please take me as your disciple." Zane frowned. "Sir, please stand up and speak. If you don't accept me as your disciple, I won't get up." The old man acted shamelessly, and this shameless act left Arlo Joan dumbfounded. Others might not know, but he knew the identity of this old man. A national healer, a master of traditional Chinese medicine. Freddie Wilson. Countless dignitaries had tried in vain to get a single treatment from him, yet such a person was now kneeling and asking Zane to be his master. But on second thought, he understood his teacher. If someone could bring the dead back to life, what's wrong with kneeling to become their disciple? If he were qualified enough, he would kneel down right now. Zane looked speechlessly at Freddie Wilson. What's wrong with this old man? Even if he taught him the yang needle, he wouldn't be able to perform it. "Sir, you must be wondering why I want to become your disciple. It's not because of your ability to bring the dead back to life, but because of the yin-yang needle technique you performed." "You know about the yin-yang needle?" Zane was somewhat surprised. Freddie nodded vigorously and said, "It's an ancestral instruction. Whenever you encounter someone who can perform the yin-yang needle, you must become their disciple." Zane narrowed his eyes slightly. After a moment, he said, "I'm not interested in taking you as my disciple, and I don't want to teach you." Freddie became anxious and suddenly pulled out a knife. To the astonishment of Zane and the others, he put the knife to his own neck and said with a look of resolute determination, "If you don't accept me, I'll die right here in front of you." Upon hearing this, Zane burst into laughter. Arlo felt embarrassed and wanted to leave. Freddie, however, had no such intention. He looked at Zane with hopeful eyes. I will write down the yang needle for you. How much you can understand will depend on your own comprehension. As for becoming my disciple, forget about it. Upon hearing this, Freddy smiled. Thank you, master. Zane raised an eyebrow. I just said, I'm not taking you as my disciple. Whether you accept me is your business, whether I call you master is mine. Freddy's shamelessness left Zane speechless. Bring paper and a pen. Freddy turned around and kicked Arlo. Didn't you hear your grandmaster? Bring paper and a pen. Arlo hurried out and soon returned with a notebook and a pen. Zane took them and wrote down the yang needle. He didn't write the yin needle, it was too against the natural order. Freddy carefully placed the notebook into his pocket as if it were a precious treasure. After a moment's thought, he felt it wasn't safe enough, so he tucked the notebook into his pants. Zane was speechless. Even April covered her eyes, finding the old man's behavior incomprehensible. Master, you go ahead and take care of your business. Call me if you need anything. Freddy threw down a business card and dashed off gleefully. From the look of it, he was probably going to see some acupuncture treatment. Zane didn't mind and turned his attention to Arlo. Arlo thought carefully and said, Miss Salazar's mother's condition has completely recovered, but she has been bedridden for a long time and needs some time to recuperate. How much are the hospital fees? Arlo smiled and said, Grandmaster, are you seriously talking about money with me? After saying that, he turned and left. Zane's eyes widened. He had always thought Arlo was quite serious, but it turned out he was a bit of a rascal too. Truly, like master, like disciple. Zane, you're really amazing. In the hospital room, only Zane and April were left. April's face was full of admiration. Zane looked at her admiring face and hesitated for a moment. He then said to her, Come a little closer. April was momentarily stunned but didn't think much of it and leaned her head closer. Zane lightly touched her forehead with his index finger. April Salazar's face instantly turned pale, and sweat poured down like rain. After about a minute, she suddenly looked up at Zane, her eyes filled with shock. Something new had appeared in her mind. It was a cultivation technique. Named, Moon Goddess Technique. Zane smiled and said, I can't always be by your side. Practice well, and one day you'll be able to protect yourself. Tears welled up in April's eyes as she tightly held Zane's hand. Zane, you. Her red lips moved closer, but Zane frowned and dodged. April's eyes dimmed, and she quickly tried to appear nonchalant. I'll practice well. In the future, I'll protect you. All right. I'm going to check on my mom. You rest first. Okay. Watching her leave, Zane withdrew his gaze. He had noticed the sadness in April's eyes. He knew she thought he found her dirty. But in reality, Zane didn't. He just believed that his fate with Ginny wasn't over yet. As long as his fate with Ginny wasn't over, he wouldn't get involved with any other woman. As for April's misunderstanding, let it be. It might help her give up any unrealistic hopes. Zane stretched lazily, changed his clothes, and went out. He didn't notify April. Leaving the hospital, he found a store and bought 2 notebooks. He sat in the square and carefully wrote down the technique of 8-9 Divine Skill. The 9 Revolutions Divine Skill is more powerful than the 8-9 Divine Skill, but there is a fatal requirement for practicing the 9 Revolutions Divine Skill. Although the 8-9 Divine Skill was derived from the 9 Revolutions Divine Skill, it is still a top-tier technique. He made a call to Mr. Six and Ben Salazar respectively, asking them to meet him at the square. Not long after, Mr. Six arrived first. He was panting heavily. Zane, is there something you need? Zane smiled warmly and said, You are the underground kingpin of J City. Isn't it a bit beneath your status to come at my beck and call? Mr. Six replied earnestly, I've said it long ago, I follow you. Whatever you do, I do. Zane looked at him, confirming his sincerity. He handed over a notebook. Cultivate according to what's written here. Mr. Six's whole body trembled as he received it with shaking hands. Upon seeing the contents, he immediately knelt to the ground. Mr. Soulsby, from now on, I swear loyalty to you. If I betray you, may I be struck by lightning and die a horrible death. Zane helped him up and said with a smile, I believe you. Mr. Six left, tears streaming down his face as he walked away. After he left, Ben Salazar arrived. He looked at Zane with eyes full of admiration. Without any small talk, Zane handed over the notebook. Cultivate well and strive to gain the strength to protect your sister. Ben was stunned. After looking at the notebook, his mouth dropped open. Zane, this. Get lost. Ben nodded vigorously and turned to leave. Zane Soulsby? A surprised voice came. Zane turned to see a group of 5 people approaching, 3 men and 2 women. The speaker was a man dressed in a white tracksuit. He had a very fair complexion, his features were ordinary, but his fairness stood out. Zane looked at him, somewhat puzzled. It really is you. Don't you remember me? I'm Gaylord White. Hearing this, Zane's thoughts drifted back to high school. Gaylord White was his roommate. Because he was very wealthy during their school days, most of the classmates gravitated around him, except for Zane. At that time, Zane was focused on supporting himself and had no interest in currying favor with others. Perhaps because of Zane's indifference, Gaylord treated him poorly and even conspired with others to ostracize him. However, Zane didn't care about it. Over time, Gaylord found it boring and stopped bothering Zane. Zane didn't have much opinion of him. During high school, people were immature and prone to childish behavior. I really didn't expect you to still be alive, said a man beside him. Zane's eyebrows furrowed. Hervey Jackson, what are you saying? Gaylord rebuked, then apologized. Sorry, Hervey speaks his mind and didn't mean to offend you. I didn't mind. Gaylord breathed a sigh of relief and pointed to the other 3 people. Don't you remember? They were our classmates too. This is Hervey Jackson, this is Ingram Lloyd. And this is Poppy Ellis. As for her, I don't think I need to introduce her, right? As he spoke, Gaylord smirked mischievously. Zane looked at her blankly. The woman's eyes flashed with impatience, but out of respect for Gaylord, she smiled and said, Forgotten already? I'm Risa Powell. Upon hearing this, Zane suddenly realized. Seeing this, Risa looked disdainful, thinking he was pretending. Gaylord leaned into Zane's ear and whispered. Back in school, everyone knew you liked Risa. Now I'm telling you, she just broke up with her boyfriend. Your chance has come. As he spoke, he winked and made faces at Zane. Zane was speechless. During high school, besides studying, he was busy with part-time jobs and had no time for romance. But he didn't bother to explain. To him, this group of people was just passers-by. Great! Today we've met so many high school classmates. I propose we organize a class reunion. Gaylord said excitedly. Zane frowned and said, Gaylord, I have something to do. What could you possibly have to do? It's settled then. Gaylord interrupted. Then, without waiting for a response, he dragged Zane to a nearby coffee shop, took out his phone, and started discussing the reunion in their high school classmates group chat. Gaylord had been wealthy since high school and still was. Many people wanted to curry favor with him. As soon as he spoke, nearly 20 out of 50 classmates chimed in. Gaylord quickly typed, dinner at 6 o'clock at the Hilaire Hotel, my treat. Wow, isn't the Hilaire Hotel that place where the average cost per person is $2,000? Yeah, I've always wanted to go but never had the chance. Gaylord is so cool and domineering. The atmosphere in the group chat was lively, and Gaylord was very pleased. Putting down his phone, he dragged Zane and the others to a mall, insisting on buying each of them a set of clothes. It had to be said, Gaylord was very generous. Even to classmates he hadn't contacted in a long time, he gave clothes. After all this, Poppy and Risa's eyes sparkled with excitement. Meanwhile, Hervey and Ingram were almost ready to kneel and lick his shoes. Although Zane declined Gaylord's offer, he still forced a set of clothes on him. After all the fuss, it quickly became the afternoon. Gaylord suggested they go to the Hilaire Hotel to wait for their classmates. Around 5 o'clock, someone arrived. April Salazar. She was the first to arrive. No one present paid much attention to her appearance. During school, April had always pursued Gaylord, but due to family reasons, Gaylord never accepted her, keeping her at arm's length. At that time, April had even attempted suicide for him. One could say that teenage love was just that extreme. Seeing her, Gaylord didn't treat her as warmly as he did Zane and the others, merely giving her a lukewarm glance. Zane. April greeted Zane and then sat down beside him. As for Gaylord, she didn't even glance at him. Gaylord's face turned a bit ugly. He turned to Hervey and Ingram and said, Go ask the waiter for some cards. Let's play landlord. Got it. Ingram ran out. Soon, he returned with the cards, and the 3 of them started playing landlord. Since April's arrival, the atmosphere in the private room had become quite subtle. Poppy and Risa looked at April with disdain. After all that intense chasing, who was she trying to act cold for now? What a pretense! Playing hard to get wouldn't work on Gaylord. April didn't care about their opinions. She whispered to Zane, "Zane, I've been cultivating for several days now, but why can't I sense the energy described in the manual?" Zane smiled and said, "Take it slow. You'll feel it one day." April nodded with a sweet smile. Unconsciously, time passed. Soon, more people filled the private room. Zane looked at them, his eyes blank. He really couldn't remember any of them. As soon as these people entered the room, they headed straight for Gaylord. In no time, Gaylord was surrounded by everyone. The conversation topics also revolved around him. Gaylord had a faint smile on his face, clearly enjoying the atmosphere. As for Zane, no one paid him any attention. Just like in school, Zane was always invisible. However, April did get noticed. Back in school, she was quite a celebrity. Although not the school beauty, she was definitely pretty. Especially with her crazy pursuit of Gaylord, it was impossible for her not to be famous. Soon, someone joked, "April, I've heard you've been single all this time. Are you still waiting for our Gaylord?" As soon as they said this, Gaylord immediately smiled and looked at April with a grin. April laughed, "I was young and naive back then. Don't make fun of me. Besides, I already have someone I like now." Wow, who could have caught the eye of our class beauty? Come on, spill it. Is it someone from our school? April just smiled without saying a word. Gaylord was a bit unhappy and said, "All right, stop talking about this. Let's drink. I'll take you all to Nightfall Bar later." As soon as he finished speaking, everyone started to chime in. They showered Gaylord with compliments, lifting him to the skies. Gaylord glanced at April with a full smile. Seeing that she wasn't looking at him, his face darkened. Hervey looked at Gaylord, then at Zane, who was talking to April. With a gleam in his eye, he asked with a grin, "Zane, you were always the top student in school. What are you doing now?" Zane was taken aback. He didn't expect them to turn the topic to him. "I'm currently unemployed," he answered truthfully. Now, Mr. Six would transfer a large sum of money to his card every now and then, and he didn't even know how much money he had in his account anymore. Working a job was something he had never considered. However, he did have some ideas about starting a company. "Wow, you're so good at studying, how come you don't have a job?" Hervey exclaimed exaggeratedly. Although the others didn't speak, their gazes towards Zane were filled with disdain. Gaylord laughed and said, "All right, it's probably because Zane hasn't found a suitable job. Let's not talk about this anymore. Once we finish this last drink, let's head to Nightfall Bar for some fun." No one said a word, and some even moved aside with disdain. It was as if being close to Zane would transfer his bad luck to them. Zane felt like laughing, these people were too obvious. After the meal, Gaylord went to settle the bill. A group of over 20 people stood at the entrance waiting for Gaylord. Some had driven, and some hadn't. Those with cars gave rides to those without. Soon, only Zane and April were left. Gaylord walked over and said, "Zane, my car can only fit one more person. Who's taking the car and who's getting a taxi?" Of course, April should take the car. How could we let a girl take a taxi? Zane, you should take the taxi. I'll cover the fare. Exactly, you take the taxi. April was about to refuse, but Gaylord waved his hand and made the decision for her. Zane, you take the taxi. Zane nodded indifferently. Soon, the car left. Zane stood by the roadside, ready to hail a taxi. At that moment, a Maybach drove up. The window rolled down, revealing Faith Heron's exquisite face, her beautiful eyes flashing with a hint of mockery. The mighty underground boss of J City can't even get a car? Zane was stunned for a moment, not expecting her to know about this. He shrugged and said, "Just a bit of bad luck." "Where to?" "I'll give you a ride." Zane thought for a moment and nodded, "Thanks." Faith raised her eyebrows but didn't say much. After getting in the car, she mentioned Nightfall Bar, and the driver immediately turned the car around. "I heard you've been having some issues with your wife recently." Faith looked at Zane with a playful smile. Zane frowned. He understood Faith's interest in him, but she was paying a bit too much attention. Seeing Zane's impatience, she took out her phone and opened a folder, which contained a recording. Mom, you're amazing. You easily caused a rift between them. If it weren't for that bastard being backed by Faith Heron, I would have tortured him to death for hitting my son. The recording was short, but Zane recognized William Mercer's voice. He looked up at her, puzzled. Faith smiled and said, "This happened when you took April Salazar to the hospital." She paused and continued, "Dirk Salazar went to ask April for money and hurt her. William was behind it all. Their goal was for you and April to meet Miss King at the hospital and cause a misunderstanding between you two." Zane's eyes widened slightly. "My sources told me that Miss King went to the doctor treating April. That doctor had taken money from William's mother and told Miss King that April was pregnant and had come to the hospital for an abortion." Zane's face darkened immediately. Faith smiled and said, "No need to thank me." The car stopped. Zane looked at the Nightfall bar nearby and took out his phone to call Ginny. The call connected but was immediately declined by Ginny. Zane took a deep breath and then called Tiffany Smith. Faith took out a lady's cigarette, lit it, and smiled as she watched Zane. Shortly after, the call connected, and before Zane could speak, Tiffany's angry voice came through. "You jerk, why are you calling me? Get lost and stay away from me." Before Zane could respond, the call was hung up. Faith chuckled and said, "It seems you've really offended them." Zane opened his mouth but couldn't find the words to speak. Thinking of William, a flash of killing intent appeared in his eyes. That bastard had been causing trouble behind his back. "Thanks," he said, then got out of the car. By the roadside, he called Tiffany again. The call connected, and Zane quickly said, "Don't hang up, I need to talk to Ginny." "What do you want with Ginny?" "I'm telling you, I've already drafted the divorce papers, and you'll get them tomorrow. I really have something important." Tiffany was silent for a moment, then gritted her teeth and said, "We're at Nightfall Bar." She then hung up. Zane looked at the Nightfall Bar in front of him and thought it was quite a coincidence. He glanced back at Faith, who smiled at him as her car slowly drove away. Zane put his phone in his pocket and walked into the bar. As soon as he stepped in, a wave of heat hit him. The music was loud, and the rhythmic beats made his heart pound. Zane scanned the room but couldn't find Tiffany or Ginny. Instead, Gaylord approached and, without a word, dragged him into a private room. They had already ordered a lot of drinks. Although Zane didn't frequent bars, he knew that every bottle on the table was expensive. Gaylord was as generous as ever. Sitting down, his classmates ignored him and continued drinking on their own. Zane took out his phone and sent a text to Tiffany. "Where are you guys? I can't see you." Not knowing if she saw it, he didn't get a reply for a long time. Zane put down his phone, feeling a bit helpless. At this moment, Gaylord came over, cheerfully handing Zane a beer. "What are you busy with?" "Nothing." Gaylord said, "I've noticed you haven't been talking. Are you unhappy?" "No." Zane frowned, not liking how close Gaylord was getting. "If you're not unhappy, then come out and have fun." Gaylord pulled Zane, calling out, "Let's go, time to dance." Everyone cheered and rushed out of the private room. Zane declined and stood by the dance floor, watching them dance for a while, then began searching the crowd with his eyes. Suddenly, Zane's gaze stopped. On the second floor, Ginny's back came into view. She was sitting quietly. Beside her, William was sitting calmly, occasionally pouring Ginny a drink. Zane's face lit up with joy, and he quickly walked over. "Ginny." Ginny turned at the sound of the voice and was momentarily stunned when she saw Zane. A hint of panic flashed in her eyes. William's face darkened when he saw Zane. "We're leaving." Zane didn't look at William. In his mind, this guy was already dead. Ginny struggled a bit. William stood up, blocking Ginny, and angrily shouted, "Let go of Ginny." A look of impatience flashed in Zane's eyes as he casually waved his hand, and William fell to the ground. Ginny's expression changed slightly, and she hurried over to help William. "Zane, what are you doing?" Zane frowned but then thought of how Ginny had been deceived by William and felt relieved. "I have something to tell you." William looked very pained, his injuries had not yet fully healed. Ginny snorted coldly and said, "Say whatever you have to say here. It's about us." "Do you really want to discuss it here?" Zane asked. Ginny's face changed slightly, and then she said to William, "Wait here for a while, don't run around, your injury hasn't healed yet." Zane listened to her words, a trace of anger flashing in his eyes. But he didn't say much, pulling Ginny's hand and walking to the bathroom. The soundproofing in the bathroom was good, although they could hear the music. Their conversation was also clear. "Ginny, I think there's a misunderstanding between us." Ginny sneered and said, "Misunderstanding? What kind of misunderstanding?" Zane took a deep breath and said, "April Salazar." Hearing this, Ginny turned to leave. Zane tightly grabbed her wrist and said seriously, "You really misunderstood. There's nothing between April and me. She was just going through some things, and I felt guilty towards her. Also, what you heard at the hospital was completely false. That day I took her to the hospital because her father beat her. It wasn't about pregnancy or abortion." Ginny frowned and said coldly, "It's been so long, I've already forgotten about it." Zane became anxious and said seriously, "We have feelings for each other. Our arguments are always about others. Ginny, I don't want to argue anymore. Can we get back together?" Ginny's eyes began to waver. "Ginny, April really wasn't pregnant. What you heard that day was all orchestrated by William. They paid off that doctor." Ginny's eyes darkened slightly. "I have no reason to lie to you about this. With your abilities, you can easily find out the truth." He paused and continued, "Ginny, think carefully, have I ever stayed out all night? That day after you tried to hit me, I saw with my own eyes April supporting you to the hotel." Ginny said. Zane smiled. Her words indicated she somewhat believed him. "That day, April left right after taking me to the hotel. You can check the surveillance footage." "But you," Ginny said aggrievedly, "do you know, for you, I returned the shares to Grandma. When you were taken to prison, you didn't ask me for help but asked Faith Heron. Don't you trust me? You know I really dislike Faith Heron." Hearing this, Zane's eyes widened slightly. He really didn't know Ginny had done so much for him. Feeling heartbroken for this silly girl, he also cursed himself for being a jerk. Tiffany was right, he was a scumbag. He reached out and pulled Ginny into his arms, holding her tightly. Ginny felt Zane's guilt and raised her arms slightly, wrapping them around his waist. "Ginny, I was wrong. I'm sorry." Ginny looked up, her eyes slightly red. "Why didn't you come to Tiffany's house to find me during this time? I've been waiting for you to come and explain. Do you know, the King Group is important to me, but compared to you, it's worth nothing. Zane, I can't live without you." Zane didn't know when he had become so important to her. He lowered his head and kissed Ginny's red lips. Soft and sweet. Ginny's eyes widened. Since they got married, they had never been this intimate. The last time they were together, it was because she had been drugged and she had no memory of what happened. This time, she was fully conscious. A bit dazed. After a while, Ginny felt she couldn't breathe and pushed Zane away. "Are you trying to suffocate me?" Ginny said coquettishly, completely lacking the demeanor of a strong woman, more like a cute little hostess. Zane laughed foolishly. Ginny suddenly seemed to think of something. "According to what you said, William has been meddling in our relationship all along?" "Yeah, if he could drug you, you can imagine his character." Ginny said angrily, "That bastard, I really thought he had changed, and he even said he introduced a great doctor for my mom. Turns out it was all lies. Alright, let's not worry about him. From now on, if we have any issues, we must speak up immediately, no more silence. Every failed marriage is because both sides don't communicate." Zane said seriously. Ginny nodded vigorously. "Hey, I've been looking for you, and here you are." Gaylord's voice came to their ears. Zane and Ginny looked over. "Who's this?" Gaylord's eyes flashed with surprise. Zane smiled and said, "Let me introduce you, this is my wife, Ginny King. Ginny, he's my high school classmate." Ginny nodded and smiled gracefully, as a greeting. Gaylord's eyes flashed with disbelief, then he smiled and said, "Since you're Zane's wife, let's hang out together." Ginny didn't mind. Wherever Zane was, she would be there. Walking into the private room, Gaylord clapped his hands, turned off the music, and said loudly, "Let me introduce you all, this is Zane's wife, Ginny King. Wow, she's so beautiful. Really stunning, like a fairy." The crowd exclaimed in disbelief as they looked at Zane. There was confusion, envy, and jealousy. Zane felt elated inside. Ginny was his pride, the pride of a man. Ginny smiled and nodded, "Hello everyone. Wow, isn't this the CEO of King Group? It really is her, I saw her on TV. What did Zane do to deserve such a wife? Could he have married into her family? That's unlikely. The King family is also a big and powerful family, it's more likely he is being kept by her. Everyone spoke one after another, their words quite harsh. Gaylord, however, did not speak at this moment. He smiled and looked at Zane. Ginny's face turned a bit sour. Their mocking of Zane was essentially mocking her. She was about to explain when the door behind them was suddenly kicked open. A group of people walked in. Where the hell is he? Where did he run off to? A burly man cursed angrily, his bloodshot eyes staring at the people in the room. Soon, his gaze fell on Hervey Jackson. You little brat, you're really here. Everyone was stunned, dumbfounded as they looked at the group that barged in. Gaylord was the first to regain his composure and quickly said, Bro, did you come to the wrong room? The burly man slapped him and cursed, Who the hell are you calling bro? Everyone's faces changed drastically. All the guys stood up, holding their bottles. The girls shouted loudly, What are you doing? Why are you hitting people? Zane pulled Ginny to the side. He glanced at Hervey, his eyes flickering. Zane understood that this group had a reason for causing trouble. Everyone shut up. The burly man roared and rushed towards Hervey, grabbing his hair. You little bastard, do you recognize him? A young man stepped out from behind the burly man, with 2 shoe prints on his body. Hervey's face turned pale when he saw him. Nephew, is this the guy who kicked you? The young man nodded, his eyes venomous as he looked at Hervey. It's him. Seeing this, everyone understood what had happened. Earlier, while dancing, he had approached Risa and tried to chat her up. However, Risa clearly didn't like him and told him off. Instead of backing off, he tried to grab her hand. Hervey saw this and rushed over, kicking him down and then giving him another kick while he was down. Hervey pointed at the young man's nose and cursed, Next time, keep your eyes open when you hit on someone. After that, he pulled Risa back to the private room. At the time, he felt very cool. But now that they had come looking for him, he didn't dare to speak. After hearing the whole story, Gaylord took a deep breath and said, Bro, I'm Gaylord White. Jackson White is my father. Could you let this matter go on account of him? Jackson White. The burly man sneered and then said to his people, Tell him who I am. A man stepped out and said coldly, He is Jesse Lowe, known in the underworld as Scorpion. As soon as he said this, everyone's faces changed. Scorpion was a ruthless man. He used to be Godfrey Mock's top enforcer. Cold sweat dripped down Gaylord's forehead. Although the white group was wealthy, they didn't dare provoke these underworld figures. Moreover, they were ruthless and even dared to kill. The most outrageous part was that after killing someone, they would just find a lackey to take the fall, and they would be fine. Gaylord forced a smile, so it's Scorpion. Indeed, my classmate was at fault here. How about this, name your terms, and I'll meet them. Hearing this, Scorpion's cold expression eased a bit. He turned to the young man behind him, Nephew, you decide. What do you want? The young man looked at Risa, I want her to accompany me for one night. Everyone's faces changed drastically. Gaylord's face also darkened. In your dreams. Risa shouted loudly. The young man sneered, It's not up to you to decide. Saying this, he looked at Gaylord and sneered, If you want the white group to be unable to conduct business in J City, then you can refuse me. Gaylord's face was extremely ugly. Scorpion, you're going too far. Slap. A slap landed on his face. Gaylord was furious, Scorpion, you may be from the underworld, but I also know people there. Have you heard of Black Dog? Black Dog? Scorpion was taken aback. Gaylord said, Yes, Black Dog is my friend. Scorpion sneered, You can call Black Dog. I want to see if he dares to stand up for you. Gaylord's face changed slightly. He then took out his phone and called Black Dog. When the call connected, Gaylord explained the situation. Black Dog was silent for a while, then said, Bro, you might be overestimating me. Who am I to ask for a favor from Scorpion? Gaylord, listen to my advice, give the woman to him, and everything will be fine. If you really anger Scorpion, you won't have a good outcome. After speaking, he directly hung up the phone. Since it was on speaker, everyone present heard Black Dog's words. Risa's face turned pale, and she looked at Gaylord with pleading eyes. Gaylord lowered his head, not daring to meet Risa's gaze. Risa looked disappointed, then turned her gaze to Hervey, Help me. Hervey was being held by the hair by Scorpion. Originally, he was thinking about how to beg for mercy. Now, hearing Risa's words, he shivered all over and shouted, "Risa Powell, I just helped you earlier. I don't owe you anything. And besides, you're with Scorpion's nephew now, he won't treat you badly." Risa looked desperate. Everyone lowered their heads, not daring to look Scorpion in the eyes. "Still calling yourselves men?" Ginny watched the whole scene and looked at their behavior with disdain. Everyone heard Ginny's words, and their faces turned red with embarrassment. Scorpion also turned his gaze to Ginny, a glint of light flashing in his eyes. He smiled and said, "Beauty, they are indeed not men, but you are as brave as any man. Why don't you stand up for her?" Ginny snorted and said, "I am the general manager of King Group, Ginny King. Let her go, and you can name your price." Scorpion laughed and said, "I don't want money. I just want you to accompany me for one night, and I promise to let her go." "Uncle!" The young man became anxious. Scorpion coldly said, "Shut up." As he spoke, he leered at Ginny, completely ignoring Zane beside her. Ginny's face turned ugly, and she said in a deep voice, "You're dreaming." I've changed my mind now, Ms. King. If you accompany me for one night today, I'll let her go. If you don't, I'll make sure all the women here are given to my brothers to enjoy, and I'll break all the men's limbs." "Ms. King, you're so kind, you will surely stand up for them, right?" This statement caused everyone present to panic. Scorpion was known to keep his word. Even Gaylord was filled with fear. "Zane, quickly make your wife agree, or we're all doomed." "Zane, I'll give you money. Is 500,000 enough to make your wife accompany him for one night? Hurry up, agree quickly." Everyone present shouted anxiously. There was only one person who remained calm, and that was April. She didn't know who Scorpion was, but she knew Mr. Six. Even Mr. Six called Zane bro, so who was this Scorpion? Zane laughed out of anger. This group of people was truly shameless. Coming to this reunion was a mistake. "Oh, so you're her husband. What, you don't agree?" Scorpion looked at Zane mockingly. Ginny didn't say anything, she just coldly stared at Scorpion. She had already sent a message to Tiffany. Tiffany would come to their rescue soon. Zane touched his nose and said helplessly, "How can there be so many stupid people in this world looking for death?" "What did you say?" Scorpion became furious and grabbed Zane's collar. Zane looked down at his hand, his eyes suddenly turning cold. "Let go of your filthy hand." "I won't let go, what can you do?" Before he could finish his sentence, Scorpion let out a piercing scream. The next moment, his body flew backward, crashing into the screen on the wall and rebounding to the ground. Scorpion almost couldn't catch his breath and groaned in pain. Everyone present looked at Zane in shock. He actually dared to hit Scorpion? "Scorpion, he acted on his own, it has nothing to do with us. If you want revenge, go after him." Hervey immediately distanced himself from Zane. Ginny was initially worried that Zane had caused trouble, but hearing Hervey's words, she was so angry she almost spat blood. "Shut up!" Hervey's face turned red, and he shouted angrily, "It's true. What would it cost you to agree to Scorpion? You wouldn't lose a piece of flesh. Now, you've hit Scorpion, and I tell you, you bear the consequences, it has nothing to do with us." Ginny had never seen such a shameless person and was trembling with anger. "Stop shouting, none of you here will get out." Scorpion got up, gritting his teeth and glaring at Zane. "Get him, break his limbs." Ginny became nervous and hurriedly said, "Don't do it, I can pay you." No one listened to her. All of Scorpion's men rushed over. Bang, bang, bang. Zane was not beaten and had his limbs broken as everyone imagined. Instead, all of Scorpion's men flew backward, lying on the ground groaning in pain. April saw this scene and the corners of her mouth lifted slightly. Looking at Zane, her eyes sparkled. She knew this would be the result. Ginny was also shocked, covering her mouth in disbelief. They had been married for 3 years, and she never knew Zane could fight like this. One person, easily taking down more than a dozen people. "You're finished, don't leave if you dare." Scorpion pointed at Zane and said. Zane shrugged and didn't say anything. Scorpion ran out, even forgetting his own nephew. Everyone looked at Zane as if they had seen a ghost. A look of disgust flashed in Zane's eyes. This shameless group of people. "Zane, I'm sorry, I was just scared earlier when I said those things." Yeah, we just said that to make that idiot drop his guard before we all jumped in." Everyone chimed in agreement. Oh, come on, you guys. Where do you get the nerve to say such things? April stood up and scolded them mercilessly. Just now, you all looked down on Zane, talking about him being a kept man and even telling him to hand over his wife. Can you be any more shameless? April, that's going too far. We're all classmates. Gaylord said. Classmates? When you were telling him to hand over his wife, you didn't remember we were classmates? April's sharp tongue lashed out. And you, Gaylord, you're the most disgusting. I'm leaving the class group, and from now on, we don't know each other. After saying that, April walked over to Zane and Ginny. Sorry, Ginny. Ginny knew why April was apologizing and nodded lightly, indicating she didn't mind. Let's go. Zane took Ginny's hand, and just as they reached the door, it was pushed open. The scorpion, who had left, came back, his gaze towards Zane filled with venomous hatred. However, he wasn't afraid now. Instead, he wore a sinister, cold smile. Weren't you just acting all brave? Weren't you just hitting people? Now that this big shot is here, let's see if you still dare to make a move. Mr. Hall, it's him.